In the old days, not so long ago, when you went on vacation, or went on a business trip, or maybe went to a conference, that generally meant one thing above all. That meant you were going to go and stay in a hotel, or maybe a motel, or a bed and breakfast. I mean, unless you had family in the place where you were going, those were your options. But that all started to change about 8 years ago, when a couple of roommates, design students in San Francisco, realized something. They realized that there was a great big design conference coming to town, which meant all kinds of people would be coming to San Francisco looking for a place to stay. And some of them would have been only too happy to pay a few dollars to stay in somebody's home, and they realized that they had a spare room and an air mattress. Surely there was somebody who was coming who'd be happy to spend a few dollars to stay in their place. But how to find that person? Well, the answer to that question was the answer that you get all the time these days. The answer was to create a web page. And so these two roommates in San Francisco created a web page to advertise what they called their airbed and breakfast. They put out the word, and by the end of the conference, they were amazed at how much money they had made so easily by putting up someone in their spare room on their airbed. And so they had an idea. Why not expand that web page and turn it into something that anyone could use who had a spare bed or a spare room or a house they weren't using at the moment, to share it with someone who was looking for a place to stay away from home? And that's what they did. And to say that their little web page was successful would be a massive understatement. And it turns out that their web page, Airbed and Breakfast, or as it's come to be known, Airbnb, is today, only 8 years later, the fourth largest hotel company in the entire world. Or at least it would be the fourth largest hotel company in the entire world if it actually owned any hotel properties, which of course it doesn't. It is simply a company that enables people to share their space in hospitality with complete strangers, and it is successful beyond anyone's wildest dreams. But Airbnb doesn't really think of itself as a business or as a company. It thinks of itself as a service. It thinks of itself as a community, enabling people to share hospitality with complete strangers. And part of the charm and the success of Airbnb is in the wonderful, even miraculous things that can happen in that kind of shared space. It is a revolutionary concept that is taking place in our time. But in many ways, Airbnb and its success reminds me a whole lot of the early Christian church. Because when the Christian faith first started out, it had an amazing, wonderful, positive message. It had a compelling story to tell. But that message and that story would have been confined to a very small space if it were not for one thing. One thing that was absolutely extraordinary in that age: travel. In those times, in those days, people did not go anywhere. I mean, most peasants, the vast majority of people, lived on the same little plot of land their entire lives, never went anywhere. So that Christian message, as wonderful, as amazing as it was, would have been confined to very small areas if a few people had not been willing to step out and take a huge risk and travel distances that at the time were almost unthinkable. But that's what they did. And it all started, we're told in the Gospels, by Jesus sending out his disciples and his followers 2 by 2 to all of the various towns and villages of Galilee and beyond. And you need to realize what a huge risk those followers of Jesus were taking when he sent them out like that. He was sending them to places where they had never been, to people that they did not know. And when they got there would not be any hotels or motels or bed and breakfast to stay in. And even if there had been, they didn't have any money with them. So basically, they were arriving as strangers in places where nobody knew them. And if somebody had not welcomed them in those places and given them a place to stay and fed them, they would have ended up sleeping on the streets, starving. So they were taking a huge risk. But out of that huge risk that they took, amazing things happened. And see, I would say miraculous things happened. First thing that happened, they made friends with these hosts who welcomed them, people that they did not know. They became friends with them, and they particularly bonded with them over the meals that their hosts shared with them. These meals were very important to Jesus, by the way. Did you notice how he stressed that point as he sent them out? When you go into someone's house, eat whatever they give you, he said. And he repeated it. It was really important. So the first thing that happened was friendship. Second thing that happened was that they brought something with them. Two things with them. First of all, they brought peace. And as they entered their house, Jesus said, "You will give peace to your hosts." And that was a real and tangible benefit in that world where there was so little peace. And Jesus promised that their peace would rest on their hosts, who were people of peace. That was a real tangible gift that these travelers brought with them. The other thing they brought with them was healing. And as they stayed with these people, as they met with their hosts and with their neighbors, they were to share healing of all sorts with the people that they were visiting. And that would include physical healing, that would have included mental and social and psychic healing, and all kinds of things that changed the people's lives that they met. And that kind of healing, that transforming of lives, came out of that notion of sharing space with complete strangers. And that is how the Christian church started, and that is how the Christian message spread, by complete strangers going out and staying in the homes of complete strangers. That's where it all started. But that was also a model that remained with the church for many years after the time of Jesus. Indeed, for a number of centuries, that was the model that continued to stay with the church. As we saw in our reading this morning from the letter to the Romans. As Paul winds up his letter to the Romans, he finishes it by greeting people in the church in Rome. And you need to recognize that the people he was greeting were people that he had never met before. He'd never been to this church. He'd never been in the city of Rome before, and yet he was sending them greetings. And he starts by commending to them a woman named Phoebe. Now, this Phoebe is apparently the person who actually carried the letter from where Paul was in Asia Minor to Rome and delivered it to the church. But she didn't know anyone there. She was a complete stranger to them. And the only introduction she had was this letter from Paul that she carried, and they never met Paul either. And yet Paul commends Phoebe to them, and he does it with the expectation that they will welcome her, and as he puts it, give her whatever she needs. Meet whatever need she has. And of course, that's exactly what happened. They welcomed Phoebe, and they gave her whatever she needed. A complete stranger. And of course, they also received many benefits from it. From doing that, Paul says to them that Phoebe has been a great benefit to him and to others. The promise in that is, of course, that Phoebe will also be a great benefit to them. So that continually sharing with space with complete strangers and the benefits growing out of that absolutely was continuing on during the ministry of the Apostle Paul. But as he ends his letter, Paul also sends greeting to other people. And in particular, and very interestingly, he greets two old friends. These are people that he knew in Greece and in Asia Minor who have since returned to the church in Rome. Their names are Prisca and Aquila. We know of these two people, this couple, from the book of Acts, where their story is also intersects with the story of Paul in Asia Minor. Now, according to the book of Acts, Priscilla and Aquila, that's what they're called in the book of Acts, were tent makers, craftspeople. And Paul worked with them for a while. If they've now settled down back in Rome, no doubt they have moved the business to Rome. And they have settled down in Rome and are making tents in Rome, which probably would have been a fairly decent business because Rome was a very hot, dry city. And you can well imagine that tents and awnings and booths would have been very useful. So anyways, Paul sends his greeting to his old friends, Prisca and Aquila. But he doesn't just greet them. He says he also greets the church that meets in their house. There is a church that meets in the home of Prisca and Aquila. What does that tell us about the early church? It tells us that the early church carried out its week-by-week business in the homes of people, in shared space, in borrowed space. The church survived and thrived and grew in borrowed space, in the homes of people. Now, we probably ought to explore a little bit, well, what did it mean that Priscilla and Aquila had a church that met in their home? What did that church look like? According to the book of Acts, Priscilla and Aquila were not wealthy people. They were just ordinary tradespeople. They had a craft. Well, ordinary people who lived in Rome in the first century, I can tell you this, did not have big houses. Very few people who lived in Rome had big places to live in. In fact, the vast majority of the population in Rome lived in very crowded tenement buildings. They built them almost up to 5 feet tall. And they crammed people into these buildings. These buildings were so highly and densely populated that most of the people who lived in them had little more than a small sleeping cubicle that they could call their own space. So, if Priscilla and Aquila were ordinary tradespeople, that's all they would have had in terms of personal space. So we need to ask, well, how could they host a church in their house if that's where they lived? Well, if they were tradespeople, if they were tent makers, as it says in the book of Acts, and they were carrying on that work in Rome, they must have had some space, workshop space, where they carried out their trade during the week. I mean, it probably wasn't great space. It was maybe just, a little bit of space on the canvas, but there it was. That's where they sold their leather and their canvas during the week. Well, I can well imagine that maybe Prisca and Aquila, on Sundays, they shut down their operation. And they rolled up the canvas and they rolled up the leather, and they invited the church in to sit on the rolls of leather. And that's how the church met. That's probably the kind of church that Paul is sending greetings to. A small church. I mean, you probably couldn't fit more than 20 people in that kind of space that met in the workshop that belonged to Prisca and Aquila. That's the kind of church that Paul is greeting. And so in those few verses in the book of Romans, in the letter of the Romans, we begin to pull together a picture of the church as it existed during the time of Paul. And it's very clearly a church that existed and grew and thrived on borrowed space. The message was spread by strangers going out and staying with strangers. The church survived and met and worshiped with within borrowed and shared space. In that sense, I think of the early church, the church of those first few centuries, as an Airbnb church. A church that survives and thrives and does really well on borrowed and shared space. But contrast that to the church that we know today. I mean, if the first century church was an Airbnb church, how do you think of the church today? The church today is essentially a Hilton church, a Marriott church. I mean, the basic assumption about the church and the life of the church today is the way you grow and develop and make a church to thrive is how? By obtaining some real estate and putting up a building that you own, and that's where the church lives and survives and thrives. That's our model of the church today. A Hilton church, as opposed to an Airbnb church. And you know, there's some wonderful things about that, of course. We have these wonderful, beautiful, often historic buildings that we do some pretty amazing things with. But those buildings are also becoming an issue for us. And they're also becoming an anchor and something that weighs us down. So we're beginning to struggle with the reality of the model of the church that we have, which is this Hilton-type church where we have to own property to make it happen. For example, did you know that even now, I think it might even be today, Knox's Presbyterian Church over in Galt, they're struggling with a decision. And that decision will likely be to decide that they can no longer continue to exist as an independent congregation, that they will have to shut down and go and amalgamate with another church. And that's likely what's going to happen. And if you were to speak to those people in that congregation about why they feel they have to make that decision, their answer would be one word. It's the building. Their building, which is a beautiful, wonderful building in so many ways, their building is killing them. They cannot afford to maintain it and do everything else. And so basically, and this is something that's happening across this country, we have churches that are being prevented from carrying out any sort of effective ministry by their buildings, by their real estate. What do we do about that? I'm not going to stand here and suggest, okay, it's time for the church to divest of its real estate and get rid of its buildings, because first of all, I know that's not going to happen. But it's also not a good strategic move at this point. I mean, obviously, we've invested so much in these buildings, we're not just going to get rid of them. And what's more, I love so many of our beautiful and historic buildings. I mean, I love this worship space, as I'm sure you do too. I don't want to get rid of it. So I'm not suggesting that that's where we need to be going at this point, but I'll tell you one thing, we definitely need to change our attitudes towards those buildings. Because we have learned, I know we tell ourselves other words, we sang otherwise this morning, we sang the church is not a building, the church is a people, but in our operations and in the way we conceive of everything, that's how we think of it. We don't know how to be the church without being the building, being in the building. And so what we need to do is to start thinking of the church in different terms. And I believe that the churches that will thrive in the coming decade, and they will thrive, will be the churches who learn to see that the church, their church, is not in any way limited by its real estate or by its building or by any particular space. How will that work out? Well, I'll tell you, when I talk to people in the church about, what the church is struggling with, what the problems of the church are, it doesn't take long before people start complaining and saying, well, the real problem, the real struggle the church has is that all of these people who have other places to go instead of church, right? So they'll start talking about, how people go are off playing sports, or how they're shopping, or working, or doing all kinds of other things rather than being in the church. And many people will tell you that's the problem we're struggling with. But I wonder, do you realize what building-centric thinking that is? Because the basic assumption behind that is the only way to be the church is to be the church in the building. And maybe the question we need to be thinking about is not, why are those people who are out there not in here? The question is, why are we not out there? Why can't the church be the church where they are? I mean, for goodness sakes, the church in Rome learned how to be the church in a tent-making workshop. Surely we can find ways to be the church at the arena, in the shopping mall, in the workplace, wherever people are. Because wherever people are, I'll tell you, they have needs. They are in need of ministry. They are in need of a message of good news. They are in need of a purpose and meaning for their lives. And our challenge is to be the church where they are. The challenge, that's where it starts. It's not about getting them to be where the church is. And I know that's not going to be easy, and I know that's not going to come easily to us at all, because we have long only known how to be the church within our real estate. But that's the challenge that lies before us. And if there's one piece of advice I would give us as we try to respond to that challenge, it's this. It is the advice that Jesus gave to his disciples when he sent them out to complete strangers in other towns and villages. As he sent them out, he gave them this word of advice. He said, eat whatever they give you. Eat whatever they put in front of you. That was his advice. His key advice, he repeated it twice. And I think that's the advice we need to take with us. Why is that important? Because in the world of Jesus at that time, diet was primarily a way of separating people. Separating this group from that group. And that was particularly true for Jews, of course, who had very strict rules about what they could and could not eat. And remember that all the disciples that Jesus sent out, they were Jews. So when Jesus said to those disciples, eat whatever they put in front of you, I can just imagine their reaction. What? They said? What? What if they give me bacon? What if they give me a roast of pork? What if they give me a lobster? I can't eat that. I'm a good Jew. But Jesus insisted, no, you eat whatever they give you. It was really important, and Jesus repeated it. Why? Because in that world, eating whatever they put before you was a symbol of accepting them for who they are, accepting all of that person without question. It's the attitude that matters. And as we go and as we learn to be the church outside of our space, that's the attitude we take with us. We don't go with our agenda. We don't go with this idea that we need to get people on board with what we think is important. We need to go open to them, accepting them as they are, listening to their real needs and their real concerns, and figuring out how being the church in response to them and their needs, what that would look like. As we do that, the promise is, this is the promise coming from that story in the Gospel of Luke. The promise is that amazing and miraculous thing